Welcome back, everybody. So we are going to be taking a look at our week 7 homework problems. To start off here, we're looking at problem number 20. So remember that this week is kind of all about ratios and proportions. All right, where a proportion is just when you set two ratios equal to one another. So for problem number 27, looks like it has two parts here. For the first part, it says to solve the problem, write and then solve a proportion. So it says an N-scale model railroad caboose is 5 inches long. If N-scale is 169 feet to 1 foot, how long is the real caboose? All right, so the idea is that we have a model here, and the model itself is 5 inches long. We want to know how long is the real caboose, the actual caboose. And we know that the scale of the model is 169 feet to 1 foot. All right. So what we need to do here first is we need to realize that our caboose model is in inches, 5 inches long, and the scale over here is in feet. So we need to go ahead and think about this in feet instead of inches. So our scale here is 169 feet to 1 foot. All right. So what that means for us, we have 169 feet to 1 foot. All right, so the first thing I want us to think about is what does this mean in words? All right, well, what this is we are saying that this is the real train to the model train. All right, and as I said in the discussion, guys, it's very important that you understand which part of your ratio is in the numerator and which part of your ratio is in the denominator. So in this case, when we're saying 169 feet to 1 foot, we're saying that the real train itself has 169 feet in length for every 1 foot in length that the model has. So we are real to model. Well, let's take a look at this in inches, though, because our caboose is only 5 inches long. So instead of thinking about that as a fraction of feet, let's just look at everything in inches. So 169 feet times, there are 12 inches for each of those 169 feet. So that's 2,028 inches. So we have 2,028 inches all over 1 foot, that is 12 inches. All right. So basically, once again, keep in mind the order of our ratio here. We have real to model. So the real train will have 2,028 inches for every 12 inches that we would find in the model. So now, we're ready to set up our proportion. All right, we have this ratio here which tells us how many inches are in the real model for every 12 inches, how many inches are in the real train for every 12 inches in the model. All right, well, what were we given in our problem? Let's take a look at it again. We are told that the railroad caboose is 5 inches long. We want to know how big is that in the real world. So we want to know how big is this in the real world. All right, that's where we'll put our variable if our model is 5 inches long. So that's if our model is 5 inches long. So let's go ahead then, and we are ready to cross multiply. Anytime that you have a fraction equal to a fraction, we can cross multiply. So cross multiplying, guys, just means that you're going to multiply on the diagonal. So we have 12 times x, and we get 12x. And whenever you cross multiply, you're multiplying on the diagonals, and you are setting these products equal to one another. And then the next thing we would need to do is multiply on our other diagonal. 2028 times 5. 2028 here times 5. And that is 10,140. 10,140. Alright, so if we need to solve for x, we're going to have to divide both of these sides here by 12. So on the left-hand side of our equation, notice that the two 12s cancel out. All we are left with is x, meaning that we have solved for x. We have gotten it by itself, which is exactly what we were looking for. So we have that x is equal to, we have, well, let's just see what this is. If we take 10,140 and divide that by 12. So 10,140 and divide this by 12, and we would get 845. Okay, so that would be our final answer, 845. Let's just make sure that that is correct. Yeah. So you have 845 divided by 12 feet. All right, so that's one thing I guess we did not do. Remember, we had everything in inches. Units are important here, so this is going to be inches. If you wanted to know this answer in feet, you would still have to divide it by 12 yet again. All right. So let's take a look at the next part of the problem. It says it says to solve the problem, write and then solve a proportion. So it says a recipe for chocolate chip cookies calls for 1 1/4 cups of flour and 1 cup of sugar. The recipe will make 3 1/2 dozen cookies. So how many cups of flour will be needed to make 20 dozen cookies? So in a lot of word problems, guys, remember the important thing to find is the question itself. And here is the question in the problem. How many cups of flour will be needed to make 20 dozen cookies? So notice how many cups of flour. That's what we're trying to solve for. So this whole cup of sugar here, we can ignore that. We don't care about sugar. We only want to know how many cups of flour are going to be needed to make 20 dozen cookies. Well, do we know how much flour it takes to make a dozen cookies or some amount of cookies? We do. It says a recipe for chocolate chip cookies calls for 1 1/4 cups of flour. The recipe will make 3 1/2 dozen cookies. So we know how much flour it takes to make 3 1/2 dozen cookies. All right, so that is important to know. So, oops, let's get rid of this whole thing. In other words, what we can say here is that we can make some ratios comparing the flour to the cookies. All right, so let's create a couple of ratios comparing the flour to the cookies. So it says here that a recipe for chocolate chip cookies has 1 1/4 cups of flour. So we are 1 1/4 cups of flour. And we know that that makes 1 1/4 cups of flour. The recipe will make 3 1/2 dozen cookies. 3 1/2 dozen cookies. All right, so there is our first ratio. And remember, guys, that this ratio is flour to cookies. So now we're going to have to set this ratio equal to another ratio over here using the same order, flour in the numerator, cookies in the denominator. and it'll help us answer this question. How many cups of flour will be needed to make 20 dozen cookies? How many cups of flour, we don't know, we're going to solve, will be needed to make 20 dozen cookies? Alright. Since we know that it takes 1 1/4 cup of flour to make 3 1/2 dozen cookies, we'll be able to figure out how much flour it takes to make 20 dozen cookies. Alright, so we are ready to cross multiply right after we rewrite these mixed numbers here just as fractions. So remember that to do that, you want to take the denominator in our numerator here. We're going to take the denominator of the numerator and multiply it by the whole number. So 4 times 1 is 4. And then you add the numerator. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 plus 1 is 5. So 1 1/4 is the same thing as 5/4. All divided by. And we'll do the same thing here in our denominator. So we're going to take the denominator of the denominator. All right, multiply this by the whole number. 2 times 3 is 6. Now add the numerator. 2 times 3 is 6. 6 plus 1 is 7. So 7/2. All right, so we just rewrote these two mixed numbers in our numerator and denominator just as fractions. 5/4 and 7/2. We have x all over 20. So now we are ready to cross multiply. So remember, you're just multiplying here on the diagonal. So you have 7/2 times x, 7/2 times x. We'll come over here to the left. So you have 7/2 times x, which is just 7/2 x, is equal to, and then you have 5/4 times 20 on the other diagonal. So let's figure out what that is equal to. We have 5/4 times 20. Remember, you can make any number a fraction by simply putting it over 1. So we have 20 all over 1. And when we multiply fractions, we just multiply straight across. So we have 5 times 20 in our numerator. That's 100. All divided by 4 times 1 in our denominator is 4. And 100 divided by 4, that is 25. Whoops. So we have 25 here. Okay, so we are ready for our next step in solving this equation for x. Remember, x was our cups of flour, right? Flour is in the numerator, cups of flour. So we would need to divide both sides here by 7/2, 7/2. So we need to take 25 and divide that by 7/2. Alright, so notice that over here on the left, 7/2 divided by 7/2, those cancel. All we're left with is x. Running out of room, but let's see if I can fit it up here. So we are going to get that x is equal to, we need to take 25 and divide that by 7/2. Alright, so we have 25. You think about that as 25 all over 1. And we are dividing this by 7/2. Dividing it by 7/2. So remember, guys, that dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So that's the same thing as 25 over 1 times the reciprocal. 7. So we divided by 7/2. That's the same thing as multiplying by 2/7. So now we would just need to multiply straight across. 25 times 2. Sorry, it's a little bit messy, guys. I'm going to put our answer up here. Running out of time. 25 times 2 is 50. And in the denominator, 7 times 1 is 7. So 50/7 should be our answer. 50 over 7 cups.